the context that we're debating on today is basically this. Right after the removal of the authoritarian regime, the public populace is prone to be even more emotional, irrational, and uninformed towards making rational or certain decisions about self-organization and political organization. The closing government and the things that we want to uphold, the values, is the purpose of democracy itself, to minimize the harms in the worst case scenario, and to have inclusion of many diverse voices of people at the cost of efficiency, which is achieved by checks and balances of power and division of branches, as my member has also already elaborated during her speech. Now, before I want to move on to clarify some of the extensions, some rebuttals against this closing. Now, the closing opposition member came up and said that demonization of these authoritarian leaders is actually beneficial because it helps these newly formed democracies not want to resort back to these systems. But this is actually very circumstantial, and it's only thinking of a short-lasting benefit, but actually goes against the fundamentals of democracy in and of itself. Moving on to a second rebuttal. Now, they say that this newly stirring democracy needs a symbol of power and a leader for democracy and a symbol of success in all these kind of things, all these kind of good-sounding things, for these people to be strong and unified. But what is the line between the symbolic powerful democracy and what is the difference between this and these authoritarian and strong, powerful, strong men? Now, this is based on the assumption that the newly formed democratic leader is very benevolent and kind, that has no desire or personal agenda whatsoever. And on the flip of a coin, they can return back to these authoritarian regimes because that's what they are used to for during like the past 50 years or whatsoever. So that point doesn't make sense whatsoever. Moving on to some of the yes.
I told you, in a context where people still have a fear of regression to dictatorship, discourse will be caught up in verifying whether new phases are trustworthy and at the expense of other discourse such as economic or forms of drafting, constitution, and other details that are very important in implementing a new system.
Let's think of a current case example. Alright. So people have been, in the case of Korea, this doesn't represent my political view whatsoever. But okay, so Park Chung-hee, he was certainly a dictator who ruled in Korea, but after, like, say for example, another democratic leader took over, but still he has the characteristics of Park Chung-hee and still tends to be authoritarian in nature. In that case, you're just mischaracterizing and assuming that this leader is going to be benevolent and has no desire and will be a symbol and will be an exact representation of the democracy that we know in this society as we know it today. So moving on to some of the things that the opening government said. Now, most of their arguments, it was based on the fact and some examples of these negative things that may happen in the case in which we let these people run. And the extension that we have exclusively provided you from coming from the closing government is that these people are unable to properly assess the sins and the shortcomings of the previous authoritarian regime because these mass public and populace tend to have these really bad ideas about these dictatorships, and they are not accurately able to assess the things they have done wrong and some of the things that they have done well. And moving on to some of the points from the opening opposition. Now, they only want to only satisfy the people's wants, and they think that allowing these people to do whatever they want and allowing these people to allow to pick whoever they want is so fundamental and so important, without the consideration of the full consequences and the lack of safety device in the case in which these democracies and newly formed democracies may fail. And when the leader does get elected, which in most cases will, there will be no safety nets, as I have also mentioned. Yes, sir.
Well, it is your burden to prove that not a single case of a democratic leader running for a campaign will be benevolent in the end. Prove to us that your assumption that they will become dictators will always stand, to the extent that none of them should ever run.
On the same logic, I don't think it's our side or our burden to prove that this newly formed leader will turn to an authoritarian regime, but we are saying that there is a high possibility, and in the case where we pass this motion, there will be no safeguard against it whatsoever. So we are trying to have this, we're trying to oppose this motion so that these people have at least a safety net and try to uphold the values that democracy stands for in the first place, which includes checks of power and trying to minimize the harms in the worst case scenarios. Moving on to some of the elaborations of the extensions that my member has provided. Thank you. Now, when the leader is successful in democratic movement but fails to lead the nation, the member has already explained that the disappointment that the people will feel towards democracy in the case of failure will be huge, and these people, in most cases, Omai exclusive extension would lead to mostly two things. First, there's going to be a huge turmoil, and secondly, there's going to be a loss of faith in the system of democracy itself. This further is a danger that undermines the principle of democracy, which upholds the inclusion of many diverse voices at the cost of efficiency. And furthermore, these people of these newly formed democratic states may think that democracy was actually, in fact, not so good, and after all, they will try to resort to other forms of political nation that may be less successful, or even resort back to these authoritarian regimes. Moving on to the second extension that the member has also provided. Now, we proved to you the dangers of the idolization of a single leader and the lionization of this figure as a symbol of democracy in itself. So this leads to a problem that people think whatever this newly formed leader does must be democracy, and period. Without questioning or considering what democracy is and what democracy should be in itself. So it will make it so much easier for that single leader to design democracy in a way that is beneficial for him, or in a way that is not actually representative of democracy that we know in today's society. So this is against the definition of democracy itself, as the people are supposed to cooperate together in deciding the mechanisms of political organization and trying to gather these various and different types of opinions that these people have to try to form a political organization that the most people are satisfied with, and also at the same time provides and remains these safety nets in the worst cases of failures. And because of the only not the examples but not principles that the opening has provided, and these exclusive extensions and additions to arguments that the closing government has provided, we are very proud to take this debate.
Last but not least, here's final. Opposition work.
As government has characterized, these mini democracies, the democratic countries, their situations are different. They go through political turmoil. It's their first time. It's the first kind of situation that they're going through. What we told you from closing opposition is that in the end, by not allowing these leaders to participate in these elections, they're going to be actually worse off. And we uniquely told you in our extensions how it's actually going to be much more easier to lead to another authoritarian regime at the end of the day. Having said that, two questions in this debate: whether it's actually just or not for these candidates to run to begin with. So when it comes to the opening government, number one, they talked about how they don't represent all ideologies. They use demonization of people who they talked about the idea of demonization or whatnot. Number one, these candidates cannot represent all ideologies or ideas to begin with. But number two, that demonization happens anyways, even if they pass this motion. But that demonization is actually worse off, which is a differentiation coming from opening opposition. Why is it worse off? Because when it comes to these minor candidates, the fundamental difference they have between these kind of democratic leaders is they lack support comparative to them. So when it comes to this issue, it's the easiest way for these minor leaders to actually gain support by more even actively demonizing these kind of people who actually supported that regime. In that sense, the argument does not stand. But number two, about the idea of neutral leaders and how it's better off under their own. As my member have told you, it's actually better on our side, because when it comes to these democratic leaders, they're the ones that actually have the power to neutralize the needs or like have incompensate the ideologies of the society, because because the general society holds respect towards them or whatnot. But thirdly, they also brought up the idea of how it actually hinders the competitions of ideas coming out. No, because these people actually went against these authoritarian regimes because their needs weren't actually represented to begin with. Thus, these next regimes won't actually hinder these kind of competition of ideas, because that was the very foundation that these kind of movement actually arose from. But when it comes to closing government, they talk about how they actually go more about principle and talk about the idea of power division, check and balance, and about how this kind of things won't be achieved because the idea of old feelings that these citizens share towards these kind of democratic leaders. But number one, they never proved to us how this is actually going, how these kind of check and balances are actually going to better happen under their model. But furthermore, even if these citizens have old feelings towards such leaders, and after they have elected these leaders, the thing is that if these leaders actually do not properly represent the needs of these citizens, these citizens will actually lose these old feelings, and so in that sense, they still have the possible these kind of measures of check and balance will still happen under our model. But moreover, they also brought up the idea of fair election happening under their model. The question we want to give you in this debate is whether all elections fair to begin with. Because when it comes to elections, and even in these kind of established democracies, there exist candidates who actually start with even more support compared to other candidates. So we believe it's completely fine with these anyways. Now let's move on to the second question regarding the impacts of these people running or not running. So number one, the idea of the situation in which these people run elections. So in this kind of situation, they talked about how opening government talked about the idea of how actually these kind of high corruption is actually possible. My member told you that our side is the side which actually prevents this kind of corruption to happen to begin with, because number one, we prevent these authoritarian regimes from occurring. But furthermore, he told you how these leaders actually these leaders were able to gain support. So in that sense, they actually need the support of these citizens. So how corruption leads to these leaders to be separated from these supporters who are whatnot. But furthermore, they also talked about how populist radical policies or like dominating media and only sending policies regarding security is going to happen under our side of the house. Number one, we believe it's completely fine if these citizens want those kind of policies to happen to begin with, because that exactly is a very value of democracy, representing the needs of these citizens. But secondly, if citizens don't like it, citizens have the power to actually shove them up through re-elections or whatnot. But furthermore, they have never told us how that kind of thing is only mutually exclusive under our model. But what happens is, if these people don't run, which was the unique extension coming from on our side, we believe that when it comes to the issue of these minor candidates, if they want to get elected, since these minor candidates on the general, they share similar number of supporters, they can't top each other in that circumstances. Because of this, because they lack these kind of political power or political support, if they want to get elected, it's easier for them to opt into searching for political capital coming from the existing people of the existing authoritarian regimes. In that kind of situation, we believe that the democracy that they want to achieve won't happen to begin with. But under our model, these democratic leaders don't have these kind of incentives because they will get elected anyways, even without the support. But furthermore, closing government came up to the podium and gave us the idea of how if this fails, that these kinds of disparity is actually going to negatively impact the general society. We believe that even if that happens, they're not just going to end at this feeling or stage of despair. Why? Because these people were the ones who actually changed the society by collectivizing these efforts. They were the ones actually who pushed these kind of changes to happen to begin with. So that desire to move on to create a better society still exists. There was a simple generalization of these people. So under our side, my member exclusively told you why it's actually especially important for these democratic leaders leaders to run because under their model, it's actually much more easier for oppressive regimes to assume power again. For those reasons, we're proud to oppose.